Thank you for joining us for our La Follette School mini conference on the question of, are we improving or can we improve lives through tax credits? We have a full program for you, and we encourage you to stay and be part of the informal discussion as well. Rather than introduce each of the speakers, we have provided you with a description of our speakers and their accomplishments. I'm going to skip that. And just as a way of background, I'm just going to briefly talk about the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit, and then turn it over to our speakers. The Federal Earned Income Tax Credit, or EITC, is a refundable tax credit for low to moderate income working individuals and couples, particularly those with children. The amount of the benefit depends on a recipient's earned income and the number of children. The idea behind it is to subsidize wage and increase labor supply, making work pay. It uses family size adjustments in order to target poor children, and it's usually a one-time payment that comes from the IRS in February or March. The characteristics of this, it has a phase-in rate, which tends to be substantial. It goes from 24% to 45%, depending on the number of children in the family. Then there's a plateau, and then there's a phase out, which is more gradual than the phase-in rate. In addition to the federal EITC, states have an EITC, 31 states plus the District of Columbia. They range from 3 to 50%, 50% in Maryland. In Wisconsin, if you have one child, it's a supplement of 4%, 2 children, 11%, and 3 children, 34%. Some states have a refundable state tax credit. In other cases, it is not refundable. The child tax credit is akin to a child's allowance. It's a monthly payment, which is distributed to all parents or guardians of almost all children in the U.S. 17 and under, which is not counted against any other income tested programs. In 2021, the child tax credit was expanded and was $3,000 to $3,600, depending upon the age of the child. That was fully refundable to all parents, including those with zero income. It is currently back to the original $2,000 per child, regardless of the child's age, but it pays for families that have about $25,000 to $400,000 of income. So with that, I'm going to turn to our first presenter, Katie Jaitner. Young is going to keep your timing, so we will keep you on time. To tell all of you that we will be sending out a resource guide for further reading and make slides available. So they will be coming to you. If you are not signed up and we have your email, please do so in order to get them. And with that, the floor is yours. Hey. Like slide off.
All right. Thanks, Bobby, for kicking things off, and happy to start the panel here. So good afternoon, morning, everyone. My name is Katie. I'm a researcher at the Retirement and Disabilities Center here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I'm really happy to share my joint work here with Yang on how the Earned Income Tax Credit can decouple parent and child health in terms of intergenerational health mobility. Does the clicker work? No. This will work. Before getting going, I want to make sure to acknowledge research support from the NIH and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And we also had a great research assistant a year or two ago who updated the PSID files for us. And right now, going forward, we're working with a new research assistant, Asha, who is going to be working with us from this point forward on this project. To set the stage for our study, there are a few key facts to keep in mind. First, health is persistent across generations, and that means that when kids grow up, their health tends to be correlated with that of their parents. Of course, there's a genetic component to this, but several studies have documented that this pattern exists even for adoptive parent-child pairs. So this is where we think that there's room for policy and environment to potentially make an impact. We've seen this pattern in terms of self-reported health status, birth weights, certain health conditions, and even health behaviors like smoking and tobacco use. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be investigating whether policy, specifically in this paper, the Earned Income Tax Credit, might affect this link. Research demonstrates that there is a positive impact of certain public policies on health, and these public policies include the EITC, food stamps, Medicaid, and others. And the benefits can take years and even decades to fully manifest. So we think that there's a potential here for policy to decouple the parent-child health link. We're going to be focusing on the EITC and specifically 3 measures of intergenerational health mobility. We've chosen this policy to start with because there's lots of variation to exploit. It lines up well with the data that we're going to be using, and it's one of the largest anti-poverty programs in the United States. As this project expands going forward, we're going to be looking at other aspects of the social safety net too, to see if parent and child health can be successfully decoupled with policy. Here we're going to walk through our hypothesized link between the EITC and intergenerational health mobility. Like I said earlier, we know that there is a non-genetic component linking parent and child health. I have a few papers listed here. It's a growing literature. The foundational one, though, is the Halliday, Mazumdar, and Wong paper from the Journal of Public Economics. So they were the first to document the intergenerational link in self-reported health status. They popularized using mobility metrics from the intergenerational economic mobility literature. And really importantly, they provided very convincing evidence that the intergenerational link in self-reported health is robust to an alternative health index that has more objective indicators of health as opposed to relying on self-reports. On the EITC side, we know that it directly leads to increases in employment, ultimately increasing income and labor supply. Indirectly, the improved labor market outcomes from the EITC can improve financial stability. We see increases in health insurance coverage, social and economic environments can change too. And when we're talking specifically about kids, we also see an increase in educational attainment for children who are exposed to the EITC in childhood. Then there's also a few studies that take this relationship a little bit further and link the direct and or indirect effects of the EITC to health for both generations in an exposed household. Of course, the literature I've cited here is nowhere near exhaustive, and it necessarily omits a lot of excellent studies, but I hope that I've at least convinced you that there is a plausible link from the EITC to intergenerational health mobility. We're going to be using the panel study of income dynamics to investigate this research question. It's pretty much the only data set that we could think of that could accomplish the task. It has over 50 years of data collection in a genealogical design. So not only can we reliably map parents and children, but we can also observe both generations' health statuses once they are adults. In addition, we can also observe the child's childhood environment directly. Specifically, we're going to be looking at where they lived, which state they lived in, and what kind of household structure they have. Our sample is going to be using the 1950 to 1994 birth cohorts, and we have about 8,400 parent-child pairs. The 1950 birth cohort is the earliest we can use because PSID starts in 1968, and so we can't observe a childhood observation for any cohort born before 1950. The 1994 birth cohort turns 25 in 2019, which is currently the last wave of data that we have in this study. The 2021 data came out just a couple months ago. And so we want to make sure that we can observe adult health. So we want to enforce that they are at least 25 years old. There's definitely reason to believe that particularly young or particularly older cohorts could bias our results, right? The 1950 to 1956 birth cohorts never had any exposure to the EITC in childhood. And later birth cohorts are only going to be observing their adult health, A, at very young ages, and B, only once or twice. Okay, but you'll see that our results are robust to using a more narrow cohort band as well. Our measure of health is self-reported health status. Basically, we are going to be following the precedent in Halliday, Mazumdar, and Wong in this regard. Beginning in 1984, respondents are asked, the standard 5-point question. If you can rate your health, excellent, very good, good, fair, and poor. We apply a transformation so that it's not on a scale of 1 to 5, with 0 representing the worst health possible and 100 representing the best health possible. We are going to be averaging observations over time with the idea that then that's going to reduce, it's going to increase the available variation in self-reported health status within our generations. Okay. And I think that's good for that. So even with this transformation, you might have some reservations about whether this is actually a reasonable measure of health. There definitely are drawbacks, but it does seem to predict other objective measures of health, like mortality. And importantly, like I mentioned earlier, the Halliday, Mazumdar, and Wong paper demonstrated that this measure of self-reported health is robust to a 21 objective health indicator when used in the context of intergenerational health mobility. One last thing, we are going to be ranking health within birth cohorts, and this is just following the literature. And there's also evidence that it's more robust to the linearity assumption that is used for the modeling. With health being linked to employment, we need to be concerned about the endogeneity of the decision to work and EITC benefits. So to circumvent this concern and create a more causal framework, we're going to be relying on exogenous exposure to EITC benefits. We're going to do just a really quick overview because Bobby already covered quite a bit of this. Federal EITC begins in 1975. States, Wisconsin specifically, added the first policy in 1983. They later repealed that and then reinstated it a few years later. We see variation by the number of children beginning in 1991. So all in all, this policy is going to be varying by where you are living, what year it is, and the number of kids that are in your household that would qualify for the EITC. And we are going to be assigning the maximum benefit based on those characteristics to each household. Here's a quick visualization of the EITC rollout, and specifically the variation that we're using. Each diamond, triangle, or dot represents a state time specific EITC maximum benefit that's available. You can see that up until like 1990, we really don't have a ton of variation, but then that variation significantly expands thereafter. And you'll see that I've stopped the figure at 2012, just because that's the year that our final birth cohort turns 18. Of course, the EITC is still continuing to expand and it exists today. So here I'm going to start with how intergenerational health mobility is measured. We're going to rely on the previous literature to calculate 3 statistics: persistence, upward mobility, and downward mobility. And you can see how those are calculated. They're very simple. They're very straightforward. They're all from this very sparse OLS regression. The only controls that are typically included are age in each generation. For persistence, you can kind of think of it as a correlation coefficient between parent and child health. It ranges from 0 to 1, with 1 representing very low mobility because parent and child health is highly related. For upward and downward mobility, think of it as an expected health rank of children conditional on their parents' health. For upward mobility, we're interested in the expected health rank of children whose parents are at the 25th percentile of adult health. And for downward mobility, we're interested in the expected rank for children whose parents are at the 75th percentile of health. To frame this in terms of mobility a little bit more, note that if parent health is inconsequential for child health, the expected health rank for children should always be at the 50th percentile. So next, what we're going to do is we are going to adjust this specification for EITC. We want the EITC to be able to alter all 3 health mobility metrics. So we're going to be using a level term and an interaction with parent-child health. And you can see how we're going to measure the effects in the pink box on your right. We also add birth state and birth cohort fixed effects to the OLS regression to adjust for other state environments or characteristics, temporal characteristics, and the structure of data availability that we have in the EITC. So in the PSID, there are about 15,000 followable individuals with self-reported health status in adulthood. What I mean by followable is that they are part of the original 1968 sample, or that they are a direct descendant or adopted descendant of one of those original sample members. Everyone in our sample has to be followable because we need to observe both parent and child health. If we were to take a spouse who married into the PSID, we would never be able to observe their parents' health. So of the followable individuals, we have about 11,000 who observe their parents' health. And you can think about this attrition as maybe particularly older birth cohorts whose parents attrit before 1984 when we can first observe their health. Adding in restrictions for age, weight, observed state of residence doesn't really do a whole lot to our sample size. The biggest restriction we have is whether the individual is observed in childhood. Even with allowing with a lot of imputation, which we do, we are allowing people to stay in the sample if we observe them at least once during childhood, and then we're going to impute that family structure. Even with allowing those significant imputations, over 20% of the sample is lost, leaving us with just about 8,400 sample parent-child pairs. So to acquaint ourselves with the sample just a little bit more, I want to call your attention to just a few statistics from the sample. First, in the first row, we see that there is a lot of variation in EITC exposure in childhood. This is among individuals who are ever exposed to the EITC. So you'll notice that the total sample in the low and high exposure groups does not add up to the main sample. But in the low exposure group, we're looking at about $12,000 of EITC exposure cumulative over 18 years of childhood. And in the high exposure group, we're looking at $61,000. The amount of EITC exposure is heavily dependent on your birth cohort though. So the high exposure group is younger, as are their parents, at the time of observation. They'll typically have a lot fewer health observations because the PSID switches over to a biannual structure beginning in 1997. But their parents have more observations because more of their adulthood occurs in the 1984 to 2020 timeframe. So while their parents' health is noticeably better, we do not detect a statistically significant difference in health for kids exposed to high versus low EITC dollars in just the descriptive statistics. Before jumping to our results, I have a couple of descriptive figures just to orient you to how health mobility looks like in the United States. For upward mobility, children born to parents at the 25th percentile of health are going to be around the 43rd percentile of health themselves, slightly higher for non-Hispanic whites. Sons and kids to married parents have typically higher upward mobility. We also see a lot of spatial variation in health mobility across the United States. And here we can just kind of see descriptively how health mobility looks for high versus low EITC exposure. You can see that we should be expecting more upward mobility, less downward mobility, but persistence looks approximately the same. What we find is that the EITC might alter health persistence Specifically, it decreases the estimated persistence coefficient by 0.001, and it's statistically significant at the 10% level. So it's marginally significant. It's a pretty small magnitude, but it is consistent across a lot of subpopulations. Mechanically, what that means is that the results for upward mobility and downward mobility are going to be pretty similar. So we're going to focus on upward mobility since there will be more clustering of poor health with lower income populations that the EITC is going to target. In terms of upward health mobility, we find pretty definitive evidence that exposure to the EITC meaningfully increases upward mobility. For each $1,000 in EITC exposure, upward health mobility is going to be increasing by 0.034 percentiles. Putting that coefficient into perspective, this means that going from the average of the low exposure group to the average of the high exposure group would equate with about a 16 percentile jump in expected health rank. This is, of course, of huge magnitude that you no doubt have questions about, and we do too. But I would point out that we have a pretty wide confidence interval here too. So rather than dwelling too much on the point estimate, I think we can safely say that we have evidence to support that there is a causal link, that the EITC improves upward health mobility, but I think we should defer to future research with a larger sample to really pin down a more precise magnitude. Okay. We also see that that effects for the EITC seem to be targeted in low income populations. Specifically, you can see that the high school or less, so parent-child pairs where the parent has a high school degree or less, is where we see the bulk of the effect. And then we also are thinking about when during childhood this exposure might matter most. Our current results are pointing to later childhood seems to be more important for decoupling parent and child health, with our estimate being significant between ages 13 and 18, but not for any of the others. But also just say the caveat is that we do have very wide confidence intervals when we break it down this way. However, we do have results by birth quarter that also suggest that early in the year births, so people who have to take a delayed credit, but a larger overall cumulative credit that's going to be clustered in later in childhood seem to have a larger effect as well. Our results seem to be very robust. Like I said, we can decrease the age interval that we're observing adult health for both generations. We can narrow the cohort bands. We can add fixed effects for the number of self-reported health status in the children's generations. We can only look at people who are staying in their state of residence throughout childhood. And the one that I'd like to call your attention to is the one that has the particularly large confidence interval, the pre-EITC. So in presenting this work elsewhere, one of the questions we constantly field is, this is really interesting, but parents' health is also simultaneously being affected as children's health with the children's exposure, right? So what we do here is we subset this to first births before 1994, and we only take the parents' health observed between 1984 and their first child's birth. So then effectively, because there is no childless EITC credit before 1994, this is only the parents' health observed before they are actually exposed to the EITC. So then this really isolates just the exposure to children, but the sample size is only about 300. So that's the drawback. Real quick, I'll bring through some mechanisms. The biggest message from this side is that our sample is not optimized to look at the mechanism. Our sample is optimized to look at the parent-child health link. We do see suggestive evidence, though, that there's a larger health effect in the children's generation than the parents' generation. We see most of the income effect in the parents' generation, but we do see that there is an increase in earnings for children as well. So, like I said, we do have some limitations, and this is our main takeaways. So thanks so much for listening and looking forward to any questions.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Kate Sims. I am really happy to be here. I'm at the University of Denver. This is work co-authored with the lovely Yang and Bobby, who I appreciate for the introduction. This was work that started when I was here at UW-Madison, so it's nice to be back and see so many familiar faces. Thank you to Katie for really like setting it up for me to be able to kind of run and rock and roll with describing the EITC. Today, we're going to talk about thinking about the US EITC program and domestic violence, which is a large part of my research agenda, and trying to kind of understand, are there potential mechanisms by which these large scale public transfer programs may impact household violence, and do we see that at a population level in reality? So I probably don't have to convince anyone of this fact, but just to get us all on the same page, domestic violence is a very large and very pervasive issue in the United States, as well as globally, affecting roughly 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men. These rates are higher in marginalized communities, so among people of color, poor folks, folks who are on disability, et cetera. And we know that DV matters, right? DV affects the way that people live their lives. And in the case of homicide, it affects women disproportionately, right? So between 1980 and 2008, 1 in 5 homicides involved an intimate partner, 72% of all murder-suicides involved an intimate partner. And so really to understand how we can address homicide, specifically homicide of women in the United States, we really need to think specifically about how to address domestic violence. So what we are going to do in this paper is ask how changes in the availability of programming and services for low-income households affect the incidence of family violence. That's a big question. It's a large part of my research agenda kind of going forward. So for this paper, we're going to narrow that slice more specifically and ask how changes in state EITC benefits, which will measure both as the presence of state EITC benefits and the total maximum dollars of those benefits, affect the incidence of DV and IPV. So I specify here DV and IPV. We're going to look at both. So thinking of intimate partner violence as being violence between 2 current or former spouses, dating partners, sexual partners, etc. And then domestic violence, opening the door more broadly to think about how is this impacting the household, which we find to be really important when we're thinking about the role of the EITC in perhaps addressing violence against children or within the family, right? How are these family stressors impacting really extreme forms of family violence? So what we do in this paper, first is we provide the first wide scale and long run assessment of the relationship between state EITC benefits and IPV and DV homicide incidents. We're going to do this at the county level. So in contrast to the work that Katie just presented, which provided this really interesting individual level, like looking at what's happening across life cycles, we're going to be thinking about this at a population level. And we'll chat more in the data and methods about the relative merits of doing that, as well as the drawbacks, because when studying domestic violence, it's always, choosing your battles. And this is the set of battles that we've chosen to face. We're going to pair this with developing a theoretical framework for understanding the links between DV and anti-poverty programs. There's a large body of literature across many disciplines understanding the causes and consequences of violence. And we really want to position our causal econometrics in conversation with that, right? So how can we actually use what we know about violence from other places to build an understanding of why we may think EITC can affect domestic violence? And then the coolest part of the paper, obviously, that everyone's here for, is that we use the state-of-the-art econometric estimators to identify this effect, which we'll chat about later. I see some smiling faces from those of you who have also fought this battle. Thank you to Bobby and Katie for really setting me up on the federal EITC, which is, this low-income tax credit. And we know that the reason that we're interested in it is because the EITC specifically works on this avenue of poverty, which we think would impact potentially family stress and therefore violence. We know that there's evidence of the federal EITC trickling down across beneficiary families, but there's less evidence about state EITC policy, which is where we're going to come in. So as mentioned, states began introducing EITCs in the 1980s. 28 states currently offer an EITC. This is in addition to the federal EITC. The state set maximum benefits range from 4% to 85% of the federal credit. So this can be very small impacts, and it can also be very large, almost doubling how much households are able to get. And we believe that this argues, or we will argue, and other folks have argued, that this is a substantial income transfer, right? This is a substantial income benefits for poor households. Eligibility is determined at the state level with very, very wide variance in how that's implemented. And importantly, some states also allow for refundability of the state EITC, right? So if you have a credit in excess of taxes that are due, this comes back to you as a check in February or March, ideally, assuming taxes are paid timely. There is a wide body of literature trying to understand the EITC. With the state EITC specifically, there are 3 papers that are pretty closely in conversation with the work that we do here. The difference that we identify is going to be through our use of data, our use of county level information on these population effects, differentiating between IPV and DV, and as well as the state-of-the-art econometric estimators. But in general, we've seen already that there is some impact of the federal EITC on violence, usually identified through income effects. But when we break this down into intimate partner homicide, prior work finds null effects, both using UCR, which is the data that we'll use in this paper, as well as the NCVS and Fragile Families data. So there's not existing prior to our paper really strong evidence in favor one way or the other. And as a spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't read the paper, we find ourselves in conversations with 2 and 3 on the side of null effects. We predict 4 key mechanisms by which the state EITC can affect intimate partner and domestic violence homicide. The first being financial stress. So thinking of the state EITC as reducing financial stress within the household and therefore stress-related violence. Household power dynamics. So creating a new source of conflict within families, depending on who the EITC is given to. Resource extraction, where potentially there are additional resources in the house over which there can be use of extractive violence. And then substitution effects. So this is one that I've been very interested in across my work, is understanding how this EITC benefit may affect these kind of long-term decisions made by abusers in terms of trying to preserve a relationship with the victim, which would therefore have differential effects on homicide versus other forms of violence. We will use NBER data on the state EITC presence and generosity from 1990 to 2019. It's an unbalanced panel. Here I have described the different details about EITC benefits at the state level. So the top being states that offer refundable EITC during our sample period, then the states that changed to a refundable status but offered one partially refundable. We're going to think about these really critically in the paper in more detail. Changing to non-refundable, offering a non-refundable state EITC, and then not offering a state EITC. So this is our treatment variation that we're going to be using in our econometrics. Oh, and one more thing. So one of the things that we all think is really interesting is being able to think about both the intensive and the extensive margins here, right? So does the state offer this EITC? Is this affecting things? But also, how relatively generous is that EITC? Is it that 4% of a federal, or is it the 85%? Do bigger EITCs have bigger differences? And we'll be able to look at that. We're going to pair this with outcome data from the Uniform Crime Reporting Supplemental Homicide Reports, known as the UCR. This provides information on lethal intimate partner and domestic violence. The key bit here is that it identifies the relationship between the victim and the offender, which is what allows us to say this is arguably IPV or DV, right? Is this occurring a homicide of a child by a parent, a homicide of a spouse by a spouse, etc. This is generously called the premier data product on intimate partner homicide. I say generously because anyone who does research in the domestic violence space knows that data is tough here, right? It is hard to find appropriate data that would be able to measure things without a large degree of bias, underreporting, sample selection, et cetera. So to avoid those issues of sample selection, reporting bias, we do focus on homicide, but there are alternative data sources folks have used, like NIBRS, which would provide incident level nonviolent data, NCVS, hotline calls, Fragile Families. In this paper, we're focusing on homicide because of that interest we have in this specific, kind of escalation status. But other work that we and others are doing is thinking about these other margins of violence. So for the econometrically minded among us, pre-trends. Do we see pre-trends? Do we see changes in patterns of violence preceding changes in state EITC levels? the TLDR, the too long didn't read of it all, is no, we don't find strong evidence of pre-trends that are statistically different from zero. If we're looking over here in this red, things are not deviating away in a statistically significant way. Here we're able to break up IPV and DV. Here in A and D is going to be all victims, and then B, C, E, and F is going to provide information disaggregated by victim sex. In the paper, we also provide information dependent on whether the victim is a child. We are a little bit more cautious with those results because there is some lack of clarity on victim child parent relationships. We know that the homicide occurred between a parent and a child, but sometimes it's unclear whether the victim was the child or not based on some reporting issues, such as, the child victim being age 47 and the parent offender being 7. So we clean those guys out and we try to handle it as best we can, but results are consistent with what we provide here. The empirical specification that we're going to use is thinking about an indicator for whether the state EITC is present in the year that we observe. We're going to do this at the county level. We're going to lag the EITC as well in order to test for changes in policy impacting changes in the next year. This is one of the limitations of this paper, is that we are really tied to annual reporting. In other work that we hope to do in the future, we want to think about more like seasonal effects, right? So are things occurring immediately after the EITC? We're going to look at the outcome variable as DV or IPV homicides per 100,000 population in that county and year. We'll use county and year fixed effects to try to address time invariant characteristics within the county, as well as county invariant characteristics over time. We include a series of control variables that we've put a lot of thought into, trying to make sure that we're addressing things without introducing further sources of multicollinearity. So one of the things that we do is we lag the non-IPV, non-DV homicide rate as a way of thinking about, are general crime trends increasing? Is there an increase in gun violence in the area, et cetera? Getting a sense of how much that's happening. We also include economic indicators like unemployment, because the EITC is tied to employment in order to qualify for it. So we want to be able to think about what's happening, as well as things that are happening at the state level, right? So what is state policy looking like? When we run tests for collinearity and correlations between these, we don't find evidence that it's confounding our treatment effect, which was a nice relief. So here is going to be kind of the basic table of results that we're thinking about. So this is binary state EITC precedents. Does that state have an EITC that they offer on these different measures of homicide, of intimate partners who are women, domestic violence of women, men, and of children? We find some evidence of significance that's popping out in ways that we try to make sense of. We find a negative effect for everyone except for IPV of women, which we find to be odd. But we're thinking about really critically. But all of this I want you to take with a grain of salt, because as I mentioned earlier, we're living in that two-way fixed effects land, right? So we want to make sure that we're thinking about this, not with our naive estimators, but updating things as best we can. So what about all that two-way fixed effects stuff? We know that these models have limitations in this space, especially when we have varying treatment intensity and varying treatment timing, right? For the standard models, we have to assume that the effect of treatment on all treated units, regardless of timing of cohorts, is the same. This is a tough sell, right? When we're talking about state policy that may affect people different over time, we have varied timing and intensity at this state level treatment. And so we have two problems here that we are going to try to address econometrically. One, we have treatment that turns on and off, and treatment timing varies. So we're going to use the Callaway and Santana 2021 estimator, which will let us deal with that. Basically, the long and short of this estimator is it's going to address our sample balance, make sure we're not using inappropriate things as controls, making sure that we're limiting our sample appropriately. The other problem we don't have as satisfactory of an answer for, which is that we have continuous treatment values, right? That degree of how much EITC benefit can you get? What's the maximum level of generosity? This is an area where the literature is currently evolving, so we are watching it closely, hoping that someone comes out with a new fancy estimator for us to use that can deal with this. But for now, we're going to focus on thinking about our primary measure of EITC presence and really saying, can we pin down as precise as possible estimators? So when we do the CSDID estimator, the Callaway and Santana, we find very similar results. So things are pre-trends are going to be insignificant. We're not seeing evidence that people are ramping up or ramping down violence in expectation of the introduction of an EITC, which may sound like a silly thing to be worried about, but we economists are very, very worried about, are people making changes over time that are leading them, perhaps because of something else that's happening at the time. And then we don't see strong evidence going out. The further we go out in our treatment window, the wider our standard errors become. This makes sense, right? We have fewer observations that are 20 years out from a change in state EITC policy, just given the length of our sample window. So we take this as evidence that is consistent with what we've found elsewhere in our results, right? We're not finding, even with better, more precise estimators, evidence of a state EITC impact on domestic violence at the county level, right? And so when we run these results, one of the things that I don't want people to take away from is this saying, state EITC has no effect on, the way that people live their lives and the violence that people experience. But what we do want to think about is, what is happening under the hood. On a net level, we can't say that we find any consistent or robust evidence. We use other identification strategies that show that significance is sensitive when we do see it. Standard errors, though, are staying close to zero. We, as always, run a bevy of robustness tests, including different inclusion criteria for intimate partner violence and domestic violence, different measures of generosity, different control variables that we include, splitting the sample. We kind of have run it through the gamut, and consistently we are finding these null results. Important caveats for this. Two-way fixed effects is constantly evolving. I swear every time I see a referee report, there is something new that I have to run, which is great. I appreciate the econometricians among us. And the other thing that we want to be really cautious about is not necessarily generalizing beyond our sample. So we know that the UCR has some historical spotty reporting issues. So we don't necessarily want to say that this is going to be affecting all counties that don't report to the UCR. But ultimately, the representation in the UCR still represents, I believe it's roughly 100 million folks, right, that are represented in counties in the UCR. So even within sample, it matters what we do end up finding. We also don't have any cases or very many cases, so we end up dropping them, of state EITC decreases or removal. So we may not want to say anything about, is this a symmetric? Would we see a similar effect if we were to remove the state EITC? We're not able to say something about that just simply because it hasn't happened for us to be able to study enough. You may have asked, well, I want to know about non-lethal violence. We agree. We would also like to do that. That's beyond the scope of this paper, but future work's needed to understand how these state expansions of EITC benefits impact non-lethal violence. I'm personally really interested in understanding how this intersects with other forms of aid like TANF, SNAP, WIC, Section 8, TBRA housing. How is this kind of basket of services that folks are able to get really impacting the violence they experience? We also are interested in perhaps understanding how qualitative measures of life have changed, right? So perhaps we're not seeing something in the DV data, but there are characteristics of these relationships that are changing. I will stop there. Generally, a speaker who ends a little bit early. This is my email address and my Twitter handle for as long as Twitter continues to exist. I thank you for your time and feedback. It's really lovely to be here.
So first, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'll introduce myself by a quick story. I'm a professor of sociology, and I'm thrilled that my son is a freshman at the business school. And we were taking a walk yesterday, and I said, "Oh, Seth, there's this great conference up here, a bunch of smart people talking about, financial issues." And he said, what are you going to be there for? You don't know anything about that. You're a criminologist. So I'm a criminologist in the Department of Sociology, and I'm interested in violence. But my specific interests are also in health outcomes, and how contact with the justice system can produce health outcomes and health inequality. And so what I thought I'd spend my time doing is just thinking a little bit about how I organize the papers in my head as someone who comes from a slightly different background. And what was interesting is how I organized them in my head was almost exactly how the authors talked about it. And what I found interesting was we reached sort of different substantive conclusions. On the one hand, a paper suggested that we see these positive effects, right? Aid is associated with upward intergenerational mobility, and we think that that's positive. And it'll be interesting to have you talk a little bit about regression to the mean and sort of how that works out. But it was really kind of exciting in that a modest investment of only $1,000 can produce these really positive outcomes. And then the authors, you kind of get excited when you get to the end and they say, but hold on, let's not, let's be really cautious in how we think about this. And they're appropriately cautious because we know outcomes can have, programs can have unintended outcomes, and policies can have a bunch of different outcomes. And that's what I was thinking a little bit about my background in criminology and some experiments or some policy interventions on domestic violence that had produced some unique outcomes. And so I'll touch on those just a bit as I move forward. And then the other paper, sort of similar sort of style, very thoughtful, convincing analysis. And aid is not associated with some of these positive outcomes, right? And we can think a little bit, as they did, about homicide rates and whether homicide is a good indicator and what we might be missing. But basically, there's a null effect, and you give people who are fair to the work such credit when they say we see no evidence of substantive, statistically significant effects. So. And you could think about it a lot of different ways in terms of whether it was the introduction of aid, it didn't matter, the expansion of aid, they're just really no evidence of effects. And the authors sort of had the same approach, but just hold on. We think there could be some sort of good in these effects. And so we have these interesting effects that we want to be cautious about, and these null effects we want to be cautious in accepting, right? So I started thinking about sort of the papers, they reach similar recommendations, right? Like more analysis, right? We want to look at the analysis and we want to do more. And really, it's really moderated policy recommendations, and we're very cautious. And so one of the things we think about is this function, are these positive effects a function of the very unique sample, right? And when we think about the paper, we found the strongest effects among the 13 to 18-year-old group, but they're probably going to have the least amount of exposure over time, right? So they're less likely to be in that group that can go 16%, if I think about the math right. They would have less exposure over time, perhaps.
So actually, when we break out into the different age categories, that's all included in a single regression. So everyone is exposed, like it's taking into consideration
Time adjusted.
Yeah.
Yep.
Your exposure in other periods of childhood as well.
So when we think about the positive effects, right, and we find it in a specific sample of a specific group, how do we think specifically about generalizing, or what estimators or what models might help us find, be more generalizable with these small effects? And similarly, when we think about these null effects, right, like for instance, is it the concern is, of course, that the main effect is masking significant within group variation, right? Is there some impact among some groups in some places? And what I thought was really interesting is the discussion theoretically, right? Like, how do we get to a given spot? And I was thinking about some work in criminology. There's an old paper in the Journal of the Marriage and the Family by Ross McMillan and Rosemary Gardner. Thank you, Ross McMillan and Rosemary Gardner. And one of the things that they found was in certain situations when a woman made more than her partner, that it increased the rate of domestic violence in the house. So it presented a challenge or a threat. And so the point was how the money flowed into the household had implications. Thank you. Had implications for domestic violence and for interpersonal relationships within the family. And so in some cases, essentially, resources presented a risk to the man. And of course, resources are coming into the household and they're not differentiated in this case. But I was also thinking about, a classic study, really thinking about domestic violence as a public health outcome And to the best of my knowledge, the Minneapolis domestic violence experiment is one of the best and only true experiments around domestic violence in the United States. And essentially, the police officers would come to an event, and assuming that it was not a life-threatening event, there would essentially be a random outcome, right? If it was a yellow incident report, they would arrest. If it was a white incident report, they would counsel. And if it was a, I don't know, green incident report, they would remove the man for 8 hours. And the initial evidence was we should arrest, right? And we had mandatory arrest policies that went all across the United States. And then subsequent analysis found that there was an interaction effect, that it was really only in effect among men who had a job, and that the job produced some social control, and that men without the job were more violent. And so we found the evidence came to light later that it put some people more at risk while it was helping out other families. And so thinking about sort of how to target an intervention, and as I, thinking specifically about the papers, thinking about when we're thinking about targeting interventions, something as big as a county level intervention and the Uniform Crime Report, and thinking about issues of heterogeneity within a county, both in terms of treatments and what violence looks like in a given county, and thinking about how do you generalize from somewhat concentrated effects, right? How do you think about integrating policies with complicated lives, thinking about timing, sequencing of interventions, and estimates and policies generated from comparatively small samples. Because I think that both of the findings, both of the papers show some really interesting effects and really interesting findings, and sort of lead us, wanting a little bit more. And so just hearing how you think a little bit about how to find effects among smaller groups or with smaller samples, or just about the benefits or limits of county level data with some looking for some specific effects. And with that, I would, thank you. Thanks. Good.
Thank you. Is this the right version?
Yes.
Is the second version? Awesome. Okay. Hello, welcome, and thank you so much for coming here. I'm so happy that so many of you are interested in talking about tax policy. So welcome. I'm so glad you're here. My name is Jessica Pack, and I'm going to present the results of this paper that was recently published along with my co-author, Lonnie Berger. The title of the paper is here, but the question that we're answering is, did the 2021 expanded child tax credit impact parental and caregiver employment? But to start, I'm going to answer your question, what is the child tax credit? And maybe more generally, what is a tax credit? So you had a gentle introduction before to the earned income tax credit, right? The earned income tax credit is a tax credit that people file at tax filing time, and then they receive a refund at, after they file their taxes, they receive a refund. And this earned income tax credit is conditional upon parents working. The child tax credit is a little different. It was introduced in 1997 and amended under the Tax Cut and Jobs Act in 2017. And then again in 2021 under the American Rescue Plan Act. And this temporarily expanded the child tax credit to give families a monthly payment for qualifying caregivers of $250 to $300 per child, with the balance of the tax credit being received at tax filing. But that isn't the only difference. I'm actually going to go through all of the differences. But part of the reason the child tax credit is important is because it represents the first child allowance in the United States. There's a lot of reasons why this is important, but the main is that it allows families the autonomy to spend money the way that they need to reach and fit children and families' needs immediately. This is different than most safety net programs. Many have been found to be responsive. So if you think about when someone has a need, how quickly can they get the support that they need? Or how big is the benefit relative to that person's need? The child tax credit is unique in this respect because it gave families the opportunity to meet their own needs autonomously. So how is it different from the TCJA tax credit? So the TCJA, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act tax credit, is in place between 2017 and 2025, with the exception of 2021. So that's what we're talking about today. And the amount of the tax credit depended on didn't depend on the child's age, rather. So for kids age 0 to 5, the tax credit was $2,000, and that was the same amount for kids who are 6 to 16. But this amended tax credit in 2021 was increased to $3,600 for youngest kids and to $3,000 for older kids. And I don't have a pointer, but you can also see that this also included kids who were 17. Parents of 17-year-olds were previously ineligible to receive the child tax credit, and that matters a little bit later. Previously, the Tax Cut and Job Act was partially refundable. So that means when parents filed their taxes, they could only receive back $1,400 per child. And the 2021 version is fully refundable, meaning the entire amount of the tax credit is given back to the families in the form of a refund. But one of the other key amendments are these advanced monthly payments. Initially, the payment was only available as a lump sum when families filed taxes. But under the amended child tax credit, they could receive advanced monthly payments for those 6 months, the amounts that I told you, depending on the number and ages of children, and they could receive the balance as a lump sum at tax filing. And then the last and perhaps the biggest difference is eligibility. The former tax credit was eligible for people who worked and who filed taxes. And the new one, no work or tax filing is required. The payments were received between July 15th and December 31st. And I can talk about how eligibility was determined in terms of like where the child lived or which parent could receive it. But basically, the child had to live in the house for at least 6 months. And that was the caregiver who was eligible to receive the credit. Around 68% of caregivers reported receiving the child tax credit, at least initially. This actually might have been updated since then. But in case you were wondering how this looks now, can I use the mouse? No? Okay, so in case you're wondering, the TCJA tax credit, you can see that there's a phase-in period. You have to have earnings in order to receive the tax credit. Thank you. And with the new, there we go. And with the new tax credit, you can see there's no earnings required. And then this amount phases out as income increases. This is just an example for folks who are married, filing jointly with one child, but it gives you a sense as to how this change might have been very significant for people in the bottom earnings quartiles. So why does this matter? Child poverty. Child poverty is a key indicator of population well-being, and it's correlated with a host of adverse experiences that we know are associated with disparate outcomes later in adulthood. There's a large amount of research that shows that ameliorating poverty early in life improves outcomes later on in adulthood. So we often refer to early childhood, the period of pregnancy to school entry, as the most sensitive period for investment into children. This is because the return on those investments is much higher later in life than investments that are remitted later on in childhood. And as I said before, the 2021 child tax credit is the first universal child allowance type program in the United States. So it has strong implications for not only child well-being, but for parental well-being as well. This figure shows how poverty changed as a result of the child tax credit. You can see the official child poverty measure and then the SPM here at the bottom. Child poverty decreased by 46% in 2021 because of this expanded child tax credit. This is massive. This is a big decrease. And then, of course, it went back up after the tax credit ended in 2022. However, employment is the primary source of income for caregivers. It is associated with a myriad benefits that the safety net cannot always match. Sometimes they can. And the reason I wanted to use this figure as an example is because you can see this is mean share of income by source in a household. And these are the months before and after a child is born. This is father's income, this is mother's income, and this is public assistance. So you can see that most public assistance programs require that the child be earthside before they can be eligible to receive the benefit. So this is one example of a time when a family could use a benefit. It would have a large impact on children's well-being in the long run, but they're not eligible. So how do we do this? The obvious thing to do would be to just make a comparison. Let's compare the employment of people who received the child tax credit to those who didn't. But this is problematic because there are differences between the people who received the child tax credit and those who didn't. The main one being they have children. This isn't the optimal comparison. There's a lot of things that might differ between these two groups of people. However, historically, economic papers have made this comparison because it gives us a sense as to how this population might respond if they receive a benefit, or in this case, a tax credit. So we also make another comparison. We compare folks who received smaller payments just because they have one child to folks who received larger payments because they had more children. And this is a little bit better because it allows us to get us to control for all those other differences between groups so that we know that we're looking at something that's more likely to be causal than correlational. So we answered this question. We basically compared parental caregiver employment to childless adults before and after the payments were remitted, right? So that's mid-2021, to different periods of time. This is called the difference in differences analysis. And we use the current population survey that has a lot of adults. It's nationally representative and state representative. And we also link children not only to their parents so that we can see a household that has children, we also identify the caregiver for children who don't have a linked, an obvious parent. And that represents about 50,000 children in our sample. What we find here is that parents are employed at the same rate as childless adults. So in this figure, I show the coefficient, the percent effects from these difference in differences regressions. And if you look along the y-axis, if the bar goes above 0, that means that parents and caregivers are working more than childless adults. And if it goes below, it means they're working less than childless adults. So the policy concern, right, that most folks have with a universal child allowance or a universal benefit is, well, people might stop working if they have a benefit that's large enough, right? So the concern is that it would decline. And we absolutely do see a decline. When we compare parents to those only in 2021, when we include those in 2018 and 2019, and when we only look at the last 6 months of all these periods. However, these effects, this one should have stars. This one is moderately significant. However, all of them are negative. For example, this one translates to an employment loss of around 344,000 people no longer working. However, what it means when I say this is insignificant is that the variation in employment doesn't differ from variation in employment in previous periods. It's insignificant. When we look at only caregivers of infants, we see an increase in employment here, but that's not significant. And when we look at caregivers of 17-year-olds, these are the ones who are newly eligible, we see a decline, but that's also insignificant. In fact, the only significant effect that we do find is an increase in employment when we compare caregivers with more than 2 children to caregivers with only 1 child. And that's equivalent to about 705,000 new people who are working. That's a positive effect. That actually goes the opposite direction that people who are critics of the child tax credit would anticipate. We also look at how the effects differ by demographic group. So the same orientation here. Now we're looking at, here's the full sample. This is what I just showed you. We have all adults, caregivers of infants, caregivers of 17-year-olds, and caregivers of 2 children versus 1 child or 2 or more. And you can see this is the positive effect that I showed you on the last slide. But here, when we look at single female caregivers, we see a decline in employment among those who are caregivers of infants. But we also see an increase among those who are caregivers of 17-year-olds. So we know that this effect is actually masked by effects that are going in the opposite direction, depending on the children's age. We see some insignificant increases and decreases among married females and single males, but then among married males, we see an increase in employment among caregivers of infants. So we were really interested in why is there a decrease in employment among single females? And is there a way that we can better understand that pattern? So what we did is we did a more granular dose response where we looked at the numbers and ages of the children in the household. And we found that for single and married females, excuse me, as the payment increases, as they have more children, work generally increases. However, for single females, hours fall, and married females, hours increase. Overall, however, for caregivers of infants, we find that as payment increases, unpaid leave increases. So what this means on net is many of the caregivers exit the labor force who have infants, but many of them stay in the labor force. And in fact, they do so by taking leave at a 20% higher rate than in previous periods. This is really exciting because it means that for the population who doesn't have access to paid family leave, which is most people, that they subsidize leave by themselves using the child tax credit. But also, this means that more people worked as a result of having the support. We think possibly through childcare, for example, because this money could be used in a flexible way. You can pay an aunt or a grandparent or somebody to help support you working. So we ruled out all these other explanations. Could it be because there was a change in the number of hours worked? No. Was there an increase in voluntary quitting? No. So we actually didn't see a difference in how many people voluntarily quit during this period, which means that that differential, that decrease, was likely driven by people who were let go. Did we see a difference in states that had paid family leave? Nope. Are there other telling demographic and occupational patterns? No. Is there other change in labor force participation? No. And if you want to see other details, kind of metrics, you can certainly download the paper and you can read it. In summary, we find that the expanded child tax credit is associated with an insignificant decline in parental and caregiver employment by around 344,000. We also find that parents with infants subsidize unpaid leave, and those with more than one child and females increased work. There's no difference in voluntary quitting. So this has strong implications. I'll talk about those in a moment. But the limitations, we have several limitations. One, we are obviously limited to a 6-month period. This policy is not permanent. So if it's made permanent, one of the key questions is, will these effects translate to this setting where there's a permanent policy in place? However, we did look at 2 months after the payments ended, and we found that the positive employment effects continued, which kind of insinuates that there would be a residual positive effect on employment if this policy were to be made permanent. We were unable to observe take-up, which obviously limits the interpretation of our results, and we can't observe children's birth date. We just know how old they are in terms of months and years. And then we also can't separate the effects of the child tax credit from other policy expansions, but we do our best to do that. So the implications. We know that child tax credits can be leveraged to offset the effects of the macroeconomy and limitations of the safety net without short-term significant impacts on employment. However, we know that the type and timing of these credits matters. So as you know, with the earned income tax credit, you receive the payment in a lump sum at tax filing. That means most of the money comes in the spring at around tax time. Whereas with the child tax credit, people receive these monthly payments and they receive the lump sum amount. The payments were received differently. And economists and sociologists and other people think that that matters a lot when you're thinking about ability for families to meet their children's needs, and B, ability to save. There was a survey recently that said that something like 1/3 of Americans didn't have $400 on hand for an emergency. This benefit was $250 to $300 depending on the age of the child. That's a large amount. And over time, you could also imagine, rather than thinking about do parents quit, you could ask a question such as, do parents save the money? Or do they invest the money in a way that's meaningful for children's well-being? Now, previous work, cost benefit analysis, found that a child allowance would have a return of 8 to 1. So for every $1 spent, you'd have an $8 return by investing in children and their families. What this means is that this positive injection of money into families could then lead to improved outcomes later in life, like reduced early mortality and improved health, less reliance on public assistance, improved education, child abuse and neglect, and domestic violence. This is something a lot of folks are thinking about. But the implications of not having those things, we don't fully understand because we've never had a child allowance in the United States before. But one thing to note is that relative to other safety net benefits, safety net anti-poverty programs, tax credits are a relatively light burden, right? Administratively, they're much easier to implement and manage than many other safety net programs. And they have this added extra benefit of allowing families the autonomy to use them in the way that they need, which in my opinion, also implies that we are treating families who are poor with dignity, which is a very good thing. So this also has strong implications for childcare. I wanted to put these figures up so that you could get a sense of how expensive infant care is right now in Wisconsin, well, relative to the rest of the United States. Infant care in Wisconsin as a share of rent is 125% higher. And then this says that Wisconsin, the share of families able to afford infant care, so where the cost is 7% or less of income, it's only 6.5%. So you can see that this policy has very strong implications for Wisconsinites and beyond when families are able to use the money to immediately meet their needs. One thing to keep in mind, however, is I don't think it's fair to be talking about minimally adequate policies. One of the things that we have to think about is not only does this policy work, does it affect employment, but is it designed in a way that continues to impact the people who benefit? For example, is this policy indexed to inflation? Does it mean that as costs increase, the benefit responds and makes sure that people can continually meet their needs, not just once when they receive this payment? So there's lots of questions that people are talking about how to optimally design tax credits. But I think the key takeaway, hopefully, that you took here is that employment, at least in the short run, is not a major concern. And the benefits of a policy like this are pretty positive. And that's all I have. Thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tim. I'm not going to buzz you with my econometrics or anything like that. I'm just going to show you some numbers. I discovered I'm a Schifferfield. That's French for a lover of numbers. And so we're going to look at some numbers. And I'm going to talk about addressing poverty and low income and Social Security beneficiary households with children, the child tax credit, and other income support programs. I want to thank Jessica for doing a lot of the basic work, so it's easy to understand where I'm going with the child tax credit. Okay, advance. All right. I'm going to talk about two papers. One is accepted in print from Social Services Review, and that's Patterns of Advanced Child Tax Credit Receipt and Spending Among Children with Retired or Disabled Household Members. And the second one is a brand new paper on why the Social Security Administration ought to be really interested in not only the child tax credit and other child-driven income support programs. And my work is pretty much always with Madeline Lesperance, also Jave Grooms, and Shore Ohaniasen. These were our junior people. They were JSIT scholars, which means that we're sort of mentoring them through. And the research was supported by the Wisconsin Retirement Disability Research Consortium. That's Mike over there, Mike Collins, who helped us get the money. You have to have a big disclaimer because we're not speaking for the Social Security Administration or anybody like that. And so we're not implying they did anything, except they review everything and they tell you if you think you're going overboard. So, but otherwise, we're not speaking for them. All right. Okay, so we're going to talk about Social Security beneficiary households with kids under age 18. That's just a quick abbreviation. And I'll talk about that in a minute. We're going to do the Pulse paper in a few slides, and then the second paper, and we're going to compare child tax credits. We're going to look at the same one that Jessica spent her time on, the 2021 only, but we're also going to compare that to the current child tax credit and the one that came before from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And then something that Greg Duncan and I and others recommended in the National Academy of Sciences study of child poverty, which we did, which is a version of the current CTC, but extended to all low-income units. And I'll summarize it at the end. So 10 to 11% of children, actually 12% in our 21 data, live in households that also receive Social Security program benefits. Okay, could be old age, could be disability, could be supplemental security income, could be parents caring for kids who get SSI, and so forth. Okay, and the numbers grown over several decades, and it's still growing. So you can see from a number of published papers, the documented rise in complexity and parental absence. This quite often happens in a substantial part of where we started in this is a group called grand families. Okay, that's where you have grandparents and the grandchildren, and the parental generation is missing. They could be in prison, they could have died, they could be unable to care for themselves, they could be suffering from opioids abuse or whatever, and the grandparents are the ones who are raising the kids. Okay, all right. So first of all, Social Security beneficiary households with children have limited economic resources, and you'll see why. This is a percentage of households with children with incomes below $35,000 in 2021. That's going to be important because if you've got two kids, that's where that rising benefit from the current child tax credit kicks into the full 2,000 credit. So if your income's below that and you don't have any earnings or don't have enough earnings, you're not going to even get the child tax credit. Okay, so we're going to be looking at that group later. That's why I'm pointing this out here. All right, so the Pulse paper. Now the Pulse is this huge survey of 180,000 people. It's done every 3 or 4 weeks during COVID. And it doesn't tell you, it does not explicitly say whether you're receiving Social Security, but it does tell you whether you're getting Medicare, whether you're disabled, and a whole bunch of other proxies that we use. Okay. And what we find is that you see that lower line over here. Okay. The participation of the households we follow every month and every wave is below that of the rest. They're poor and they need more help. They're not getting that help. That's the first thing that you see here. Okay. And so we got that out of the Pulse survey. This thing isn't working, but this one is. And you find that Social Security beneficiary households are significantly less likely to receive payments. 0.97 was those who received the CTC, 9 points lower. The disabled were just a little bit below. So this is what these numbers represent is the distance from how many points less a particular group is participating compared to the other groups, the ones who aren't in this situation. So you see that to wrap up, can be some pretty big differences in receipt, even after you control for other factors. Okay. So what's going on here? Why aren't they getting the benefits? All right. So to answer that question, okay, we'll summarize this. The CTC can deliver large and sustainable child poverty reduction and achieve policy goal of helping families raise their children, but the payments have to get to the families first, okay? Children living with Social Security beneficiaries are less likely to receive benefits for multiple reasons. It could be disabled, hard time applying. Many don't file income tax forms. And if you don't file an income tax form, then you got to find another way to get out of the program, okay? We also found in the Pulse paper that those who received a CTC used payments as intended. The spending's all related to raising children. They don't save much of the money. They spend more of it on food and on child goods, okay? So where we come out with this one is barriers by design and due to program complexity should be addressed, especially those that impact low-income, non-tax filing and complex families. That's where we have a 3-generation family, okay? So that led us to the next year, or our next paper. We said, okay, we found this in Pulse. Then we, this year, we looked at a second paper that just was released last week, right, Holly? Yeah. And this is why Social Security Administration would be interested and child tax credit and child-driven income support programs, okay? Child-driven income support programs means that, you know, there are a number of programs where you get more benefits if you have more children, like the SNAP program, the Earned Income Tax Credit program, as well as the CTC. So we're going to look at three different variations. Now, as Jessica told you, the ARP CTC, that's the one in 2021 was $3,000 to $3,600 per kid. That was the maximum benefits, fully refundable, no earnings test, 2021 only. Now, the total cost of this is not small, right? That's important. It's 170 billion, okay, 110 billion per year above the current child tax credit, which is annual, not monthly, $2,000 max, not refundable without substantial earnings, as Jess pointed out in that slope. We're going to look at that in a minute. Unless you earn 25 to 35,000 or more, you only got $1,400 a kid maximum. Okay. And it costs about 60 billion. And then we're going to look at this third one where we're going to take this CTC. We like to pay it monthly, but we're going to make it fully refundable. So in other words, all we're going to do is to go down and get all those people at the bottom who are left out of the current one. That costs 72 billion. So that's only 12 billion more. 12 billion more than the current program. Okay. All right. Now, you saw this from Jess. Here it is again. Here's the child tax credit program. This is where we were, right, with 2021. And you can see here that a big part of this, in case you don't realize it, if you're a married couple, the $2,000 prior law CTC doesn't phase out to $400,000 a year. If you're making $400,000 a year, do you really need a $2,000 child tax credit? If your answer is, if you're Senator Mike Lee or you're Senator Ted Cruz, yes. So it really helps a lot of high-end people who may not need it. And you could phase it out, as I have in a couple other papers, a little more quickly. But the added one, the added part phases out around 135, 140,000. Okay. So that's the one we're going to look at. And those, we're going to look at those numbers. And this is the prior law again. And we're going to look at the prior law a little more carefully in just a second. The reason is because here is just the prior law one. Okay. 23% of those SSA households with kids are down there below 25,000. That's just for a single parent. It's 35,000. This program, it looks just the same, but it's 35,000 if you have two adults, two parents. Okay. And you see that 23% of households, Social Security households with kids, are down here. They're not getting anything, or they're only getting $1,400, right? So the NAS CTC, all we're going to do is to take this blue line and cut it right across. So in other words, we're going to make all those people at the bottom fully eligible for the $2,000. That's the main difference. We like to pay it monthly too. Okay. So you've got three different sets of programs. All right. What do we do? Let's see. You know what? The Social Security benefit households are more likely to benefit from virtually the Earned Income Tax Credit, SNAP, and the EIPs were the one-time benefit, the $1,400 that people got in 2021. I mean, that's a simple one-time thing. It had an effect, but we're not interested in that. That's not going to come back. Okay. And SSI units, grand families were ones that have much lower participation. Here's the marginal effects on poverty of each of these programs. So before Social Security obviously has a big effect, 20 points. Okay. The ITC gave you a couple points. SNAP gives you 5 points, the CTC 5 points. So don't rule out the fact that SNAP, the feeding program, is really important for these families. Okay. And the EIP pushed it down further. Okay. You had bigger 2021 CTC effects going from the pink to the orange, and Social Security disability families and then SSI families up to 10 points. So getting it to these people is really important, right? So what are we going to do? We're going to drop the COVID only effects, the EIPs. Then we're going to count for everything but the CTC. Okay. All we had to do was run the numbers off the tape to get to 2021. That's already on it. But then we simulated the others. In other words, we said, what happens if you're operating under the other rules? There's no labor supply effects included. That's a caveat. And as Jessica pointed out, maybe 300,000 fewer. Okay. And the results could be expanded to go far beyond just what we're looking at here. In other words, beyond poverty. So here you are. These are non-Social Security units. You can see each of these, ding, 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 had an effect. Okay. All right. And so the difference here is if you took the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the current CTC, it only affected our population by, a very small 1%. The expanded CTC got you another 3 points, another 5 points, I'm sorry, 11 down to 6 or 7. And the NAS itself got you 3 points. So the NAS one gives you a pretty good effect for a small amount of money is essentially what we're saying, okay? In other words, this program, if you extended it downward, it could really help. It could really help those low-income families who would be included. Right? Clear? All right. Now, summary slide. We're looking at a difficult but not inconsequential population. All right. 10 to 12% of all kids, 3 million kids in grand families only. Foster kids are in there too. All right. Policy makes a difference, but policy implementation makes a difference. This is why Senator Romney and I and others, and in the National Academy report, said the Social Security Administration should get involved in benefit eligibility determination and processes for Social Security beneficiary units by working directly with them, okay, or working directly with the IRS, not sending them to an IRS website. And people who got email, you may be eligible for this. Oh, you have to go to this website, and the website up until November for non-filers was designed by Intuit. Intuit is a paid tax firm. Intuit's job is to make filing taxes difficult and hard, so you use more of their services. And this wasn't a terribly successful way to go. Okay, plus you're just coming through COVID, and it was the end of, it really didn't work very well. Now, finally, there should be no earnings test in any case for Social Security beneficiary households. There should be none. Why? If you've got somebody who's totally disabled or they're taking care of a severely disabled kid and they have low income or they're retired, you want to subject them to a work test? No. So, I mean, we could have any sort of CTC reform that we wanted, but we wouldn't have to say, we could say, but these families are exempt. If you're providing more than half of the support for more than half of the year to a kid and you're their caretaker and you're Social Security beneficiary, you shouldn't have to work. If you can work, fine. If you can work a little bit, and many of them do, that's how it should be, okay? And even if you take the current CTC and the NAS suggestion to extend that down to the bottom and make it easy to file for those people at the very bottom, including the 12 to 14% of Social Security beneficiaries who don't file income taxes, it would have a huge effect on them, okay? And if you want to save some money, phase out the CTC below $400,000. So there are ways of saving money. And in case you're wondering about this, sometime over the next 9 months, we're going to have a huge tax bill in this country. Why? The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, big drop in rates for high income people and corporate tax cuts expire in 2025. Many people want to put those back in. All right. The Democrats' price for that, their number one target is to put in some sort of a CTC reform. Many want to go back to the expensive, at this point, the expensive 2021 reform. But others, just a stopgap is, why don't we spend $12 billion and extend what we've got now down to everybody who has incomes below that. We're talking about $2,000 a kid a year. That's, that helps people who really need it. It doesn't create a lot of serious disincentives. So both of these, I think, are really things that we're thinking about now, and they're live policy at the moment. So thank you very much.
All right, good afternoon. I'm Jeff Smith. I'm a professor in the economics department, an affiliate, I guess, of some sort of a Follett school, and the associate director of the Institute for Research on Poverty. I'm delighted to be here at a La Follett event. I recognize that I am the only thing between you and lunch, and more salient between me and lunch, I guess. But nonetheless, I will offer some comments on these two papers. I'm delighted to have had the opportunity to discuss work by several of my favorite people on campus. That was fun. Oh, use a laptop. Okay. There we go. So there's two kinds of pandemic people, it turns out. One kind, when the pandemic arrived in March 2020, put down all their existing research and said, I will write COVID papers now. And the authors I'm discussing are in that type. I said, whoa, I can finish old stuff. So I finished my book that I started in 2003. That's why I'm the discussant and not an author. This is interesting and important work. I think that was perhaps plain from the presentations. And the analyses, as you heard, and is even more apparent upon reading the papers in detail, were carefully done and thoughtfully done. So I want to start with praise, not just because it's a nice rhetorical technique, although it is, but because I genuinely liked the papers and think that they are worth paying attention to. Oops, see, I really want to. Let me. So I'm sort of a labor economist, sort of a public economist, and sort of an applied econometrician. And I just came from teaching econometrics to master's students, actually, so it's kind of in my head. So these comments are going to be a little bit about epistemology, as I want to say it, but with a purpose, a policy purpose. So I'm not going to get up here and tell you my policy proposals. I'm happy to talk about them at lunch. But I want to think about the meaning, in particular with the Pack and Berger paper, of the estimates for policy and how much weight we should put on those estimates in thinking about what to do going forward in the sort of new tax regime that we may get in a year or two. So the estimates in the Pack and Berger paper, the sort of headline number is 344. If you look at the conclusion of the paper, they actually highlight two of their different strategies and give a range of kind of 350 to 500,000 people who are not employed as a result of the expanded child tax credit. This is characterized in the paper as small, but it's not ever explained small relative to what. And I think it is small relative to those critics. I will call those critics Bruce to save time. So relative to Bruce, it is small, right? Bruce Meyer at the Harris School of Chicago and his co-authors have a much larger estimate. But is it small in an absolute sense? I would have liked, and the paper's published, so unless they write another paper, and maybe they will, they can't address my criticism in that sense. But I would have liked more of a discussion of sort of our metric of size. And related to that, and this is a statistical point, but again, I think one relevant to thinking about what this evidence means for policy. So the standard thing you do in classical statistics, which is what most of us do most of the time, is you test a null hypothesis, right? There's some baseline and you say, is there enough evidence in the data that allows me to say that that null hypothesis is not true? And the default null hypothesis in sort of all empirical work in the social sciences, for good or ill, is that the effect is zero. Now, and by testing that null, in this case, right, the standard errors are large enough that you cannot statistically distinguish the 344,000 number or the 500,000 number from zero. That's the sense in which you then say sentences about this estimate is insignificant. And this is a little hobby horse of mine, the use of insignificant in ways that sort of combine statistical and substantive significance, but here you're referring specifically to statistical significance. I would argue that we have a whole ton of evidence and we have a whole ton of theory that says that the effect of expanded child tax credit on employment isn't zero. That we sort of know that going in. This is a topic that lots and lots of people have studied, not surprisingly, in general, not just related to the child tax credit, but the effect of income guarantees and implicit tax rates on labor supply. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of papers on this. We know this number isn't zero, and so I would have asked them to have sort of bucked the norm and not tested this null of zero, and instead compared the estimate to some other number. But this is what people often do. So to me, we kind of know this is not zero, and so I want to focus more maybe on the magnitude. And the paper does a pretty good job of this, I think, relative to the literature, of taking the magnitude seriously and not immediately saying, oh, well, it's not statistically different from zero, therefore it is zero, which is wrong, though very commonly done. But I would have gone a bit farther and said, well, can we reject the null that it's 800,000 people? And I think the answer to that question is no. Right. The fact of the matter is that the data here just isn't that big. And so the information that we can get out of it is just not that good. And that's just a fact of life. It's an unfortunate fact of life. It's a fact of life that has to do with how much money we were willing to spend on this survey that was done. And it's a cool survey. It was a cool idea. Would that had been 2 or 3 times as many people, or that they'd figured out a way to get a higher response rate, then we would know more. And so I would, I guess, put a little bit less weight on this estimate in some ways than the authors might. As you heard, there's a whole host of subgroup analyses and sort of what one might call mediation analyses that are based on splitting the data in various ways. I think those are all underpowered. That is why I have this line here, my kingdom for a larger sample. Nobody offered their kingdom to have a larger sample on this, so we didn't get one. But I don't know what I would have done if I thought about what would I have done if I was the editor of this paper at JPAM. And I think the editor is actually another one of my favorite people. But I don't know. Maybe those would have gone. So there's knowledge here, but it's deeply limited by the nature of the available data. So what they did the things you want to do, they talked about them in reasonable ways, but there are fundamental limits here that I think lead me to put a bit less weight on this estimate than Jessica and Lonnie might. Tim's paper, I will confess, I read the other paper first, and as a result, because of limited time and more detail than Tim's papers, but I enjoyed Tim's papers, and I learned a lot of interesting descriptive stuff about the increase in complex family arrangements over time that I thought was pretty interesting. I would have liked, especially in the paper that was the unpublished one that's written for SSA, more stuff about measurements than I got. There was some imputation with somebody's tax model or something that wasn't really described, and I didn't know what it was, and maybe all the people at SSA know what it is, and they're the audience, but I didn't know what it was. There's a lot of measurement error, as many of you probably know, in benefit receipt in general. There is a lot of non-response in the census pulse data. There is presumably, in addition to that, measurement error, and not classical measurement error, but asymmetric measurement error. The people tend not to report receiving things that they didn't receive, but are very commonly report not receiving things that they did receive. And I would have liked a bunch more about that. It doesn't have to be a whole treatise on measurement error, but I think the SSA needs to be reminded about data quality. You may be sensing a theme here. And yeah, my little snide remark, we're not a superpower like Denmark, but wouldn't it be great if we could have high quality linked administrative data that bona fide researchers could easily get access to? All right. The last major point I want to make here kind of applies to both papers, and that is about external validity. So one obvious thing is COVID. I was on a twig for a Department of Technical Working Group for a Department of Labor program that was doing random assignment of its treatment when the pandemic arrived. And in our twig meeting, not long in the summer, I think of 2020, we had to decide what to do, right? We're spending all this money, random assigning this treatment that is not easily ported online, but sort of they tried to port it online. I argued that a good use of taxpayer dollars would be to stop randomly assigning people, to wait until the pandemic was over and then restart the experiment. My side did not win. And so we have an experimental evaluation of a program that doesn't look like anything that's actually going to be a program unless we have another pandemic. You know, this is fall of 2021, so things had recovered a bunch in some states, not as much in other states. That's something that they don't actually go down the road of, which would be interesting to do. My sense is there's a lot of heterogeneity in the speed of return to normalcy. And finally, and this is a much broader issue, and this goes back to the negative income tax experiments, which have some history down the waterfront in the social science building, among other places on campus. They were worried about these issues that if you have a temporary transfer program, you know, UBI, as we would call it now, or child credit, that it matters how long it is. That if you have a short but generous one, then people may move kind of their leisure over time to this period when you have the short but generous program. And so you will overstate perhaps the response. What we'd like to know, really, I think, is what's the response to an ongoing, permanent, you know, as permanent as anything is, program. And there's a bunch of dimensions of that. Some of that is people's intertemporal optimization problem, as we would call it in economics, of when to take their leisure. Some of it is take up, right? Presumably a permanent program, people would eventually pay the fixed cost of taking it up better than they did during the fall of 2021. Take up would be higher, that would be different. Maybe we'd even jigger, maybe our dysfunctional legislature would make it less of an ordeal mechanism to take up the program, as Tim pointed out. You know, in a very long term, you might get behavioral responses to a child credit in terms of fertility and in terms of human capital investment, specifically by caregivers. None of that can be gleaned from a super temporary program. And I would have liked more chit chat about that in both of these papers. So thank you for your attention.
Well, it is both the time to get some food and a time to ask your questions. So thank you to all the speakers. I hope you're willing to actually postpone getting your lunch while some of the others have lunch. And we're going to open it up for questions. Let me suggest that if you have a question, we want to encourage you, but for people to hear it, it would be best if you came up here. It's just a suggestion. You can ask from any place. So let's just open, and why don't we start for lunch? Why don't we say that people on the lake side from the back start, and it'll go forward and then around. Anyone have questions or something that they would like to raise to any of these speakers?
I'm David Reamer, former state budget director. I was involved before that in designing the state earned income tax credit. So I have some knowledge of this area. But my question has to do with what I sense is a movement in the thinking about tax credits. I've seen a number of proposals that shift from the current arrangement to kind of a recombobulating of the credits. So the starting point is that the current EITC is both a worker supplement and a child credit built on top of that. So it's really, one can think of it as two credits in one. The child tax credit was based on earnings, but only after a certain point, then not based on earnings, and now back to being based on earnings again. So it would, the movement that I've been seeing in a number of proposals, including some of my own, have been to do something frankly that was first implemented. I'm not sure if it's still there in the UK in 2002, which is to have a worker's credit and then a child credit, two separate credits. So the child credit would in essence take the child piece of the EITC, combine it with the child tax credit. And then in addition to that kind of reconfiguration, have a very large earner's credit, not just a couple $100, but thousands of dollars. And then the new child tax credit or kind of built on top of that, also very large. So you'd have two large credits. The worker credit would be based on earnings, a percent of earnings, often with a longer plateau, and then a phase out much further out, maybe at a slower phase out rate, not as far out as the current up to hundreds of thousands, but shorter, starting maybe 80,000 and phasing out at a marginal tax rate that doesn't create too much distortion. And then the debate would continue as to whether the child tax credit should in some way be connected to earnings or not at all. I've suggested, as Tim knows, the idea of basing it on an adult's relationship with the labor market in some manner, but not necessarily based on current earnings. So for example, if someone had current earnings or qualified for the Social Security benefits, or was receiving Social Security benefits, or qualified with Medicare, all of which data SSA has, you could create in essence a kind of workers, kind of a list of workers. And then if there's someone on that list, whether they're currently earning or not, and they had a dependent child, they'd get the help. So the question is, sorry for that long background, but the question is this: if you switch to a model in which workers would get a credit based on their individual earnings, not based on their combined marital earnings, like the current EITC and at least the current child tax credit. So based on individual earnings, and then you had the child tax credit just based on the child and some parents' relationship with the labor market. What impact would that have, for example, on health, on violence potentially, on poverty reduction? Just, it's hard to kind of get one's head wrapped around this, but I know all of you at this table can, and most people in the audience can. I'm curious what you think about that model impact on the things that have been discussed so far.
I mean, we have people can hear us. Yes. Yeah. Okay, cool. I mean, I think one question that I would have would be about the mechanism of disbursement. So one of the advantages to doing a family-based tax credit is family-based taxes, right? You file as a pair if you're in if you're married, filing jointly. And so therefore using the married numbers makes a bit more sense. So I think the question would be, are we tying this still as an income tax credit, or is it some other form of disbursement that is going to be able to account for individual income? From a violence perspective, I think that ties in nicely to a lot of the mechanisms that we've talked about in our paper. Is this something that is going to, one side of the relationship, and how is that affecting the dynamic? Is it actually potentially going to create an opportunity for individuals who are experiencing violence to have income that is theirs, right? A refund or a credit that comes directly to them. So I don't think there's a given answer that's going to shake out one way or another. I think it would depend on implementation. But I think it could have potentially very different impacts for households, especially, those who are having, experiencing violence or experiencing, other forms of chronic stress.
If you look at other rich countries, thank you, Jeffrey. Okay,
I'm pushing your buttons, Tim.
thank you.
I can leave it to you. Oh, it's on now.
Okay. If you look at other countries, they have both. They have they call it the working family tax credit. They borrowed that from us. we have the earned income tax credit. So there's a working family tax credit. And they also have a child allowance. And they mix and match in different ways. In Australia, the child allowance is huge. It's universal for everybody. There's no earnings test and it makes a huge impact. In other places, it's smaller. In the UK, so Angus Deaton, I just want to know about Prize, told us when we released a report, how when he was a graduate student, he was a newly widowed graduate student, he had 2 young kids, how important the child tax credit was to him so he could keep studying and keep working. That was in Scotland. So that you can put them together in different ways, and we're going to put them together in a different way too. Although there is one proposal to try and collapse them together, which I don't quite understand. But the important thing is they're all, let's say, targeted universalism. It covers more than half of the children in all countries, but it fades out. In Canada, it fades out above $70,000 a year, and it's all gone by like at $110,000 a year. It's much bigger than ours, and it has a huge impact in Canada on child poverty and on child well-being in the long run, we assume. So you can mix and match them any way that you want, and some of that's going to go on when this tax bill comes up later on. There are already a lot of different proposals out there. The other thing is delivering it. The IRS is great on delivering a credit to stable families who've been paying taxes for the last year or two. Boom, they know where you are. Boom, they know that you declared those 2 social security numbers, those 2 kids on your tax form, and bang, you got the credit. So the biggest beneficiaries were working, poor, Black, 2-parent households in the Deep South who really needed that money, and they got it immediately. But if your family circumstances change, or you have a complex family, or 2 different people are claiming the credit, then the IRS doesn't work so well anymore. You need somebody else to adjudicate it. And for our population, we've got 16,000 Social Security offices out there. They have other things that they're doing, yes, but they could very easily help you make a basic determination and then send you to somebody else, to a number of nonprofits who are willing to help you get the benefits you need. There's something called, that I'm going to be looking at next year if we get the next grant, called Kinship Action Group, where in particular, these populations that we're talking about are advised by nonprofits in the state. Some states have them, some don't. And the SIP, which we want to use, the 2023 SIP, has got all sorts of information about did you participate or didn't you participate in the child tax credit. So that's the next step to keep going. Thank you.
Have you turned this on? Oh, there we go. Maybe not. I would just add that the other, yeah, I don't think it works. Okay, that the other concern is the policy context, right, in which a tax credit like this that's paired with work would be enacted. So for example, if a person lives in a state where in order to qualify for childcare support, you have to be working first, then it doesn't make much sense to require that they have to work in order to receive the tax credit, because then they don't have childcare in order to receive the tax credit in order to work. Then it's almost like the policies are working against one another. So one way to think about it would be like, can we design a system of policies? And this is what the NAS, the NAS panel did that Tim was on, right? They thought not just about one policy, but a system of policies that work together to cohesively support families. And one of those things, if you think about childcare, would be to decouple childcare from the work requirement so that families can work, can first get childcare and then work, right? Which is the natural order of things. So that they can then qualify, right? If it were to be coupled with work, that would make more sense to me. But I think it's not just childcare, right? It's all of the other policies too that support and enable people to work. So obviously it would depend.
I think what I would say is, I think it's a very interesting question. And I think a lot about particularly parents maybe who are at the lower end of the distribution of health, maybe so much so as they can't work. And so then they wouldn't necessarily be eligible for the EITC or the CTC as it's currently formulated. And so I think it would be really interesting to think about how that would affect the intergenerational link. But I don't know that we have the data to do that right now.
Well, actually, it's very interesting. 25% of the families in that pulse survey that you don't like, said they use their money to buy childcare. Why would they do that? Maybe because they were gonna go to work. It's small. And Jeff, there's one more thing. You should ask the Census Bureau where they get their tax package. These tax, we didn't do any simulations. They came right off of it.
Mhm,
Okay. And they did do some matching with IRS. There was a
Okay.
working paper by a guy named Ed B that inside the Census Bureau, you could match IRS records with census records. You could match individual people to their IRS status.
And is that the data you use?
Yeah, that's the data we
Oh,
use.
then you should talk that up.
I'm sorry. Next time.
Not
I will.
usually, not usually a
At
complaint I
20
make to you.
minutes,
They
two
should talk more,
papers,
but
bing, 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 but yeah, you're right, I should have said that. I mean, the IRS and Social Security work together a lot. Medicaid determination, for instance, you have to, it's just that they could do it more easily, that's all.
I had a different question if there were no questions from the audience.
Oh, you can ask.
All right. My sense is that child credits in other countries are often justified primarily or strongly as pronatalist policies. That is not part of the discussion in the US, is my sense. I would be curious to hear the people who thought about this in a more substantive and less econometric way than me, how they think about the pronatalist potential of this policy.
That is something a number of people have talked about. We read about it in one of our other papers. But it doesn't seem to have had a very big effect. Okay. The Australians wanted a pronatalist. That's why Peter McDonald, a demographer, and they had a temporary effect, but then it faded out. In Korea, where I was in July, they have a small child tax credit and they have the world's lowest birth rates, of course, too. And they had, and one of Donna Ginther's students whose dissertation found some effect in rural, not in Seoul, where things are really expensive and people are driven to work 50 hours a week, no matter what. But it had some effects in rural areas, which probably worth more and where wages are lower. But it hasn't had, you know, in my mind, if the cost of children is one of the things that's stopping you from having kids, and many people say it is, also the unavailability of childcare, but other things, then reducing the cost of kids isn't going to hurt you. But
your prior is that there won't be much of a pronatalist effect.
no. The obvious alternative is immigration and bringing in populations that want to have lots of kids. And guess what? We're doing that in this country right now. So, I mean, and I think, you know, maybe more than some people want, but that's what we're doing. There are only 2 countries in the world where you get citizenship by birth. I have relatives in both of them, Ireland and the United States. So the only 2 countries where if a child is born in the United States, that child is a US citizen, even if their parents aren't. And the same in Ireland. You have to be in Ireland 3 months first because they had all sorts of planes that had to turn around because somebody who was 8.9 months pregnant was on the plane, was having the baby on the plane. So they said you have to be there for 3 months first. But otherwise, it's, you know, it's more difficult. You don't get the full rights of, and those children, 90% of the children of immigrants in the United States were born here. Okay. Were born here. And they're as eligible as anybody else for all of these benefits. They're citizens. So that's another issue, but anyway. Come on, guy, all of you can come up. Somebody go put some quarters in my tax meter outside. That's all right. It's gonna become a $25 lunch soon. Go ahead.
So my question is, why aren't tax credits part of the greater social safety net conversation? Because based on this presentation, I just get the sense they're a lot more effective, efficient than traditional, subsidies or like social security payments. Like, I'm just curious why tax credits are part of the bigger conversation and ultimately not the whole social safety net.
It's pretty simple, I think. Yeah, there was Aaron Ladovsky once said, the tax system was where big social benefits go to high. So you're looking at something, you're talking about something, you're gonna spend 107 billion on something just by itself. We're gonna have a child allowance. Oh my God, that's huge. You can't, but if you bury it in the trillions that are in the tax code, that's where it looks small, it looks more modest. Bob Greenstein has 2 or 3 nice papers on this. And he argues that the vehicle for getting there in the United States is the tax system, the income tax system. And that is why it's a child tax credit in our country. It's the easiest way to do it. And that's true, actually, because there are trillions and trillions of dollars floating around in tax bills and tax cuts. And for the most part, this doesn't look too big. You can make it, make it smaller through various things, but that's why. And in 2021, when this benefit was being paid along with the EITC, the largest distributor, the largest agency overlooking targeted benefit payments in the United States was the IRS. They were spending more than Social Security Administration.
Thank you all very much for your presentations. I'm very interested in your presentation, Kate. 20 years ago, I ran a shelter for domestic violence victims. And I was sitting there thinking that I've been out of that world for a long time, but it used to be that it didn't matter what your socioeconomic status was. You were equally as likely to be involved in a violent relationship. And so I'm wondering how you use that information when you chose to write your paper on this.
Awesome. Thank you for bringing that up and chatting about it. A large chunk of my research agenda actually specifically focuses on DV shelters and trying to understand the roles that they play in mitigating violence and how they can best do the work that they do. I think one of the interesting pieces that we see when we're talking about domestic violence is this is a process that happens over time, right? So anyone can be impacted by violence, but how that violence shakes out, what you end up actually seeing, how extreme it gets, is often a result of people's ability to mitigate those risk factors, right? So, do you have the ability and the connection and the network to go stay with someone else when situations are bad? Do you have the financial stability to make sure that you can move out to actually leave the relationship? Do you have all of these different pieces that you can put together? That said, though, there is this degree of violent relationships are these very irrational things, and it's hard to leave even under the best of circumstances. So the way I see it, when looking at the EITC, we're asking, does the EITC potentially impact the likelihood of any of these situations escalating? And also, does it potentially lead to different outside options for folks? Like, do they have the ability to leave? I think one of the challenging parts of empirically measuring at a population level a question like violence is these are such unique stories, in talking with people who run shelters, in talking with survivors, the process by which someone finds their way into a shelter is often very unique and identified. And so something that I'm thinking about long-term with my research agenda is how can we honor and respect that individuality, but also make effective policy, right? How can we bring the individual experience into things that we're able to do at a local or state level? And I think a lot of what I'm coming to realize and see throughout my research is we can do these big policies, but when we really want to think about how to impact like the day-to-day, we're thinking maybe instead of broad strokes, how can we use local supports to really meet people where they are? So.
And to just jump in as a criminologist, financial stress is definitely a risk factor for domestic abuse and interpersonal violence. Broadly defined, financial stress is a strong predictor.